our Phillies man on the scene, our guy for all the answers. That's Frank Klose, our 97.3 ESPN Phillies Insider, Philadelphia as well. Frank, moving the mailbag back a little bit in the show today, but how you doing, bud?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
We're doing okay. Baseball is almost here. They've announced their opening day starter. All kinds of news coming out of Clearwater, but not a ton of drama, right? It's been a little anticlimactic.
Yeah, there's only a few storylines, and many of which have been asked in the mailbag. So not many major issues, no injuries. So it's been pretty good for the Phillies in that regard.
Well, let's dive into that mailbag, the aforementioned mailbag, and the first name in it is a guy that you and I briefly talked about last week on the air because, I love those Creighton guys, and that would be Pat Venditti. Does he have a chance to make the opening roster? And Zach would like to know more about Pat Venditti.
Well, I think already Pat Venditti has been a lot of fun to watch. His first outing with the Phillies, he strikes somebody out from the right-hand side, switches to his left arm, strikes somebody out, switches back to his right, and strikes out the side. Isn't that pretty cool? So I think he has caught Phillies fans' attention. But I think the Phillies kind of view Pat Venditti as somebody who is better than AAA, maybe slightly below Major League level, that you can kind of stash at AAA for when you need somebody. And I think if the Phillies are picking up a guy like Pat Venditti, I think it has a lot to do with the left side of the mound because the Phillies don't have a lot of left-handed options. But I think the two that are going to make the opening day roster from the left-handed side of the bullpen are Yoeli Rodriguez, who the Phillies acquired for Antonio Bastardo a couple years ago, who's pitched pretty well, and Adam Morgan, who's had a pretty decent spring. He's probably going to get the shot to be the other left-handed arm. And the reason why those two are the favorites is not so much their performance, although, like I mentioned, Morgan's been pitching pretty well, but it'll have a lot to do with the fact that they're on the 40-man roster. And, a lot of what we're going to be talking about this week and next week and into opening day is how do they deal with that 40-man roster crunch? Because, you don't want to cut somebody that you'll regret cutting later. And you want to try to hang on to as many of your prospects as you possibly can. And somebody like Pat Venditti, who was outrighted off the roster by the Mariners earlier this offseason, is not on the 40-man roster. So somebody like Pat Venditti probably goes down to AAA. And then later down the line in the season, if they have a major injury that requires a 60-day disabled list stint, or if Yoeli Rodriguez really can't cut it in the Major League bullpen, or you get to the point in July where they trade somebody and they have some roster flexibility, somebody like him is somebody that you can go to and not feel terrible about because he pitched in the major leagues. He's played with a few clubs and usually pitches to a 4-ish earned run average, which isn't wonderful, but at the same time, he's not going to come in and implode. So I think the Phillies plan for him to go to AAA to start the season with the idea that he could be somebody who can spell some relief down the line.
We'll go pitching to pitching, Frank, and Brandon wants to know, is it safe to say that Eichhoff has become the center point of the Cole Hamels trade?
Well, it's a pretty fascinating question, and Jared Eichhoff has really turned a lot of heads lately, not because he's the dominant type pitcher, but basically because he's a real model of consistency on the mound. Now, if you think back to when they made the trade, the Phillies got 4 pitchers. Now, let's cross Matt Harrison right off the list because he was never more than just a salary dump that the Phillies took on. But if you had to rank the 3 starters they acquired, first being Jake Thompson, second Alec Asher, and then third Eichhoff, really that Eichhoff was probably third on that list. They saw Thompson as the big pitching prize, and the follow-up prize was Alec Asher, who still had some upside and who still might be a decent major league pitcher. But Eichhoff was kind of the guy that they got just with the idea that he was at AAA and he's somebody that they could immediately throw into their starting rotation. So if you traded Cole Hamels, you need somebody who can come in and just throw some innings. I mean, really, that was the only thing they seemed to have in mind when they got Eichhoff. But Eichhoff has really shown that he can, he doesn't throw really fast. He doesn't have a high 90s fastball. His fastball is in the lower 90s. But he mixes it up really nicely with a change and a curve. And he kind of shows that he's got a really good head on his shoulders and is going to pitch you a good 6-7 innings every time that he goes out there. So I think he's been a really, really nice surprise. I still think that the centerpieces of the deal are Nick Williams and Jorge Alfaro. They haven't really realized their potential yet. But if you had to look at that trade and say who's been the best piece so far, I think Eichhoff is a great surprise that sort of came out of nowhere because in the minor leagues you don't throw fast. They're probably not going to pay attention to you. But he looks like he could be a very solid number 3, possibly somebody's number 2 starter in the major leagues, and I think that's a really awesome thing to have.
Speaking of the pitching, Frank, I want to ask you because one of the things about this team is that I think people understand that this roster is rebuilding. Yes, you have veterans in there to kind of fill the gaps, but this team is rebuilding. So as a result, we know that guys like Hellickson, Buchholz, they're probably not here beyond this year and next year. So in your mind, who are the guys outside of the obvious ones, Hellickson and Buchholz, who are just kind of filling the gap and could maybe be moved at the trade deadline?
Yeah, in terms of the starters, I think Eichhoff is probably third behind Hellickson and Buchholz, and Aaron Nola will get the starts, and Vince Velasquez will get the starts. On the pitching side, I guess the really thing that they have to move are the 2 relievers they acquired this offseason that are Joaquin Benoit and Pat Neshek. The starting pitchers, having 2 of them that you can flip are pretty significant. I think they hope that somewhere down the line that Jake Thompson and Zach Eflin claim 2 rotation spots from them. Would work out even better if they have a trade partner that could trade for one of them. And I wouldn't rule out the Phillies moving somebody earlier than later. Jeremy Hellickson, for example, I mean, he's owed a lot of money. Some people might say, well, that's an awfully high salary to take on. Well, the Phillies have money, so they can eat that salary at any time. Now, the Boston Red Sox, they just lost David Price. And right now, the leading candidate to replace David Price, you know who that is? That'd be one Kyle Kendrick.
Oh, yeah.
So I bet you they regret trading Clay Buchholz to the Phillies. So, they could make a move. I mean, the Phillies are interesting from the standpoint that, if you're a team that suffers an injury right now and you look around the major leagues, how many teams out there feel right now that they could trade a major league player off their major league roster? Most teams are about to start the season thinking like, hey, we have our guys, or they're thinking, how can we get better? Or they're thinking, perhaps naively, we have a chance. So Phillies can strike it really at any time, and who knows? Maybe even the Red Sox call the Phillies about Hellickson. I haven't heard anything of the sort, but they're in a good position where they could still subtract now or later from that surplus and really surprise you.
Deal from wealth, not from need, I guess is what you're trying to say there, Frank Klose. Have enough pieces to be holding the cards. So we'll close with the last question, or at least we'll get into the last question of the Phillies mailbag. Not you. You didn't ask your own question. Another Frank wants to know, do the Phillies add any more bats before opening day?
Here's the thing, and the fact that we just talked about kind of segs right into this, because you see the Phillies, they're a team that has money. They have prospects, and you never know what's going to be out there. So I don't think that the Phillies are actively looking to add bats. I mean, I'm not sure if Frank is asking the question because he feels the Phillies need to add some bats, or because, he's just curious what the trade market's like right now. But the Phillies are in a good position where they don't need to rule anything out. If you see at the end of spring training, a lot of times you have a player available at the very end of spring training. Maybe he's the 26th man on a really good team's roster, and you know that he's going to be an upgrade for your ball club, so you grab him. This year, the Phillies probably just can go in with an open mind. I wonder if they might make a trade to perhaps solve their roster crunch. I mentioned frequently Tyler Goeddel. He doesn't have a clear spot either in AAA or in the majors. You don't want to just give Tyler Goeddel away or just cut him and let some other team claim him, because a player like Goeddel, if you try to put him through waivers to send him to the minor leagues, another team is just going to claim him and they're going to option him to the minor leagues. So there could be some sort of trade where they they get something back that could help them right now. But I think it's all about managing that 40-man roster. They don't have an open spot where if the 26th man gets cut off another team, that they can just grab them and throw them right on their roster. So, there's players like South Jersey's Matt Caesar, who could possibly, make the Cubs, could possibly not make the Cubs. He's having a nice spring. A year ago, the Phillies, they probably would have grabbed somebody like him if for some reason the Cubs decided to move on from him as a player who's out of minor league options. But this year, they don't have the room to just grab somebody. So if they do anything at all, I think it'd probably be a trade where they trade a 40-man roster asset like Tyler Goodell for somebody who's not on the 40-man roster. And if they make a trade like that, then maybe they have the ability to grab somebody. But right now, it's just that numbers crunch. And but I think the Phillies will be open-minded for anything. If something comes down the pike and it makes sense and they feel it's worth losing a prospect for, that I think they'll do it. I mean, they're not expected to contend, but they're in a very enviable position for a major league ball club. They have a lot of assets. They're about to hit the major leagues. They still have some veterans right now that they could trade, and there's really no pressure to do anything. So if it makes sense, you listen, and if you get a good deal, you do it. But I don't think they're actively looking to add a bat heading into this season.
Frank, the Phillies are slowly trimming down the roster, as you mentioned, and one of the guys they sent down to AAA was Jorge Alfaro, J.P. Crawford, and others. And I want to ask you, of the guys like Nick Williams and Alfaro and Crawford who are going to be in AAA, of those guys, which do you think we'll see up first during the season?
My money would be on Jorge Alfaro. I personally think, based on what we saw from him at spring training, at the World Baseball Classic, I think he's a little bit ahead of Andrew Knapp right now. But the reason he's not your backup catcher and why Andrew Knapp is probably going to make the team despite barely hitting all spring is that you want Jorge Alfaro to go play full time. And I think the Phillies could send somebody like Alfaro. Keep in mind, too, Alfaro has a month service time under his belt now, kind of as a September call-up last year. I think if you get to maybe middle of May where they can essentially add another year of control and have this year not necessarily count towards his major league service time. If Andrew Knapp is really scuffling, if Cameron Rupp isn't doing much at the plate, I think maybe you swap them out because he's on the 40-man roster. Andrew Knapp's on the 40-man roster. You need a backup catcher right now, so that's probably Knapp. But if Alfaro is playing every day and you get to the middle of May, maybe June, and he's just kind of making a statement that, listen, I need to be in the major leagues, then I think they would consider swapping him out for Knapp, and then Alfaro can start taking some playing time away from Rupp. But as long as Rupp is there and playing well, they're really in no rush to bring Alfaro up to the major leagues, and I don't think they want Alfaro to come up until he's going to play. And right now, the place where he's going to be able to play every day is at AAA. So I think he could come up to the major leagues now. I think he would be ready to sort of ease in a backup type role, but I think that's going to go to Andrew Knapp right now. And very soon he could see the major leagues.
Frank Klose with us, talking Phillies baseball. Frank, last year at this time, or maybe a little earlier than this time, was when Aaron Altair went down and ended up breaking his wrist and took a long time to get back. And when he did finally come back in that last month of the season, you got a little glimpse. But how has Aaron Altair looked this spring, and how has he responded to a new hitting coach in Matt Stairs?
Well, all reports are that he's very fond of Matt Stairs so far. And I think I said this last year a few times, that injury he had is very, very hard to come back from. And wrist injuries as a whole, really to get your bat back is very, very hard. You don't realize how much having a nice, stable, steady wrist goes into your swing. So, you think back to Jason Worth, and the Phillies happened to get him off of the scrap heap because he had a wrist injury and because he had struggled for a while before he really regained his old form. Me personally, I think he's got a lot of tools, and I think he's probably not all the way back from that wrist injury, but he's well on his way. I think he's a real favorite to make the Phillies roster as the fourth outfielder, and he'll probably play against some of the tough lefties, in a platoon type role with Michael Saunders, although it probably won't be a straight platoon. But I think the Phillies are still high on him. Remember the Phillies have two outfield spots where they have veteran types like with Howie Kendrick and Michael Saunders who could be moved at some point. So Altair could replace one of them if there's a trade, and I think he could also replace one of them if they're scuffling, because let's face it, if either of those players aren't hitting that well and you need some offense, and Aaron Altair is playing pretty well, I think they would just give it to him, because if they can't trade those guys, then there's no need to play them. So I think that Altair is going to be in the game a lot more than you realize. I think he's a very, very toolsy player, plays some smooth defense. I think we haven't seen the best of his bat. I think that will come around. And he's one player that I would look toward and see a bright future for. But again, it still remains to be seen if he's going to be a starting type player or a reserve type player. But he definitely has some tools.
Frank, one of the stories that's floating around out there, which is based on a couple of baseball insiders having a conversation, and a story was written about it, and then someone said it was a report, but it's not really a report, is the conversation the Phillies could be the team that gives either Bryce Harper or Manny Machado a $400 million contract. Now, we know that these guys are going to be a free agent soon, and in the free agent market, anything can happen. It's kind of a twofold question I want to ask you. One, could you see the Phillies actually pouring $400 million into one player? And two, do you think that Harper or Machado would be a fit for what the Phillies' plans are?
Well, I think anytime you can, I'll say this flat out, I think anytime you can substantially upgrade your position, you do it. The Phillies back in the day didn't say, well, we don't need Jim Thome, we have Travis Lee, right? So I think anytime you can upgrade substantially like that with some of these premier players, you find a way to do it. Now, I think those reports are kind of grounded in reality, because the Phillies general manager Matt Klentak has said on multiple occasions that, hey, when the young guys rise to the major leagues, so we'll be ready to spend. So you kind of have the situation you're in now where you let the big prospects rise through the system, and then you realize that not all your prospects are going to work out. I mean, it'll be wonderful right now if, the likes of Dylan Cousins and Nick Williams and Roman Quinn are all of a sudden like really strong major league players, and you have too many and you don't know what to do. But chances are somebody's not going to work out. Somebody's going to get injured in a way that changes the course of their career. So probably what's happening now is the sorting out period. And then when you get to the point where you're in like 2018 and you look at the Phillies payroll, they have like nothing committed to players. So really they can spend more than anybody else. Of any team that, if you look at the Chicago Cubs, heading into last season, they just opened up the checkbook, right? They signed John Lester. They signed that was the year before. They signed Jason Hayward last year. They were trying to put the final touches, supplement the young players that they had, however they needed to, and they won a World Series. So I think that's the idea behind the rebuild: is you kind of get to the point where everybody gets to rise. You see what you have, and if there's an opportunity to improve, you do it. And that's not to say that if you can sign Manny Machado and you want to make him your third baseman, that doesn't mean that Maikel Franco leaves the team. I mean, maybe there's room for him at first base, or, sometimes maybe a player like him, you trade him for even more assets for your system. I think one of the problems the Phillies had in the past was they got very attached to their guy, and they wouldn't consider a move like that. But if I think this leadership in the Phillies organization, if Manny Machado is available and can be had, you figure out the rest later. You want to get the best possible players on your roster, and I think they're very committed to opening up the checkbook when the time comes. Whether it's Bryce Harper, Manny Machado, who knows? But I think you're going to find a situation where you have some big names in the free agent market, and of all the teams out there, the Phillies are going to have the most money, because all these young players right now, they won't hit their payday for another 5-6 years. So Phillies are in a really enviable situation in terms of being able to sign the next batch of key free agents.
You hear that, Yankees fans? That's Frank Klose here on 97.3 ESPN. Less than 2 weeks from now, the Phillies finally get to play some meaningful baseball. Jeremy Hellickson versus Scott Feldman at the Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati. That's on Monday, April 3rd. That may not be the sexiest of opening matchups, but it is between two rebuilding teams. It kind of fits the narrative of where we're at right now, Frank. Sort of anticlimactic, but the Phillies, they're okay with boring as long as they continue to build. Frank's with us each Tuesday for the Phillies mailbag. The way it works, you find him on Twitter at Frank Klose with a K, and send him your questions, and then we answer them on the Sports Bash on Tuesdays. Thanks, Frank. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.